And good, bright, and beautiful morning. My name is Kimberly Mann, and Ido Diaklos, he went up into the Aras, and when he kathistos, Methetes came unto him, and he anoigoed his mouth and did ask of them, saying, Makarias are the patokas enuma. Wait, I thought she said this was easy Bible study. That doesn't even sound like English. How can that be easy? That's a great question. And actually, today's episode, our Wisdom and Worship Wednesday today, is inspired by a comment on my channel because there are some people out there who think that the King James Version of the Bible is the only version of the Bible that is legitimate. I realized after talking to this person for a little bit that they didn't actually know what the Bible was written in because they've been brought up in a probably some kind of cultic situation. So we're going to talk about how the Bible was written, what it was written in, and how that is impactful and why it is so important when we're talking about studying the Bible. So we'll be right back right after this.
You can have all this world. Give me Jesus.
And welcome back. And if you do find any value in this content today, do me a favor, click like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of my content. And I do look forward to seeing you guys here every single day. But the thing you also need to remember is that God's word is meant to be shared. That's why this channel exists. That's why a lot of other Bible channels exist, because there are a lot, probably hundreds, maybe even thousands possibly of YouTube channels. It's very likely thousands of YouTube channels about the Bible. Some of them will be good. Some of them will be not so good. And definitely they're not all in English. And so you do need to, if you're in another language, share the Bible channel that's going to reach the people that are closest to you. And if that is English and it's mine, great. But if it's another Bible channel as well, share, because God's word does not return void. And that is what is the most important and impactful thing that we as Christians can do. So let's get into this a little bit today, though, because we are talking about, okay, this is going to be a little bit fun. This week we're playing around with something called a playlist, so we'll see how well this works as far as camera switching. So we are talking today about biblical languages and what languages the Bible was written in and why this is so very important to your Bible study. So let me give you a little bit of background as to why knowing the books of the Bible and knowing what languages they were written in is so important. Okay? So start off with the fact that the Bible is written in 3 different languages. It is written in both Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And the original parts of the Bible were written in original different languages. And we're going to talk about that in a minute here as far as which parts were written in what and why that is important, of course. But the Bible was not written in English. And anybody who thinks that the Bible was written in English, or anybody who thinks that the King James Version of the Bible is the only version of the Bible that is legitimate, they're not legitimate. Because the reality is the Bible was not written in English. In fact, our modern day English didn't even really exist until like 1500s. Somewhere around the 1500s. So you really can't say. So are we saying that the Bible didn't really exist until the 1500s? Oh, heck no. Absolutely not. We're going to talk about some of the languages the Bible has been written in and kind of maybe some of the progress. I don't have one of them on here, but I will briefly touch on the final language the Bible was translated into prior to it going into English and why that was part of the reason why the King James Version was such an important version. Okay, so let's first of all go to this. We're going to go to this camera right here, and I'm going to show you the biblical languages. And we're going to start with these. All right, first of all, what are the languages that the Bible was written in? All right, well, first of all, the Bible was written in 3 languages. And if I can get it to stop, I apologize. All right. So all of the Old Testament was written in, with the exception of just a few passages, all of the Old Testament was originally written in English. I'm sorry, in Hebrew. Goodness, why did I say English? That's crazy. So it was originally written in Hebrew. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. There is one exception, and that is Aramaic. And we're going to talk about that right now and where Aramaic comes from and what it is. So first of all, Aramaic still exists today, just in different forms and by different names. But Aramaic was a language that was around since the beginning of time, but rose to prominence after the Chaldeans and the great Babylonian Empire. It was the trade language of the world at that time. So we have a couple of things. So first of all, the first time that we see Aramaic, let's start this, is actually in Genesis. Genesis 31:47. It contains a couple of Aramaic words. And now that's important. And the reason that's important to understand is because Aramaic existed for centuries before we saw other major parts of the Bible, but it just wasn't the common language of the world. But it's not surprising that Genesis chapter 31 verse 47 would have that, because Moses, who wrote Genesis, would have been very familiar with many ancient languages. You need to remember Moses, and we'll talk about this when we get to that part, but Moses was raised by the pharaohs. So he was educated as if he was one of the pharaoh's sons. So when we see writings from Moses, we really should not be surprised when there are other languages, because he would have spoken many, many, many languages. He would have spoken Hebrew. He would have spoken some form of Egyptian. He would have spoken Aramaic. But we look at verse 31. We look at Genesis 31, verse 47. All right. And here we are. Let's find the passage. And it says, and Laban called Jagar Sahadutha, and Jacob called it Galeed. All right. So it's a super simple. Well, guess what? Those words in Aramaic, those were just actually like names, like the names of things. All right. So Laban called it one thing and Jacob called it Galeed. These are different words, different names for the same exact place. And that's the only place in the rest of the Old Testament that we find Aramaic in just a single verse. So there's a very good chance that it wasn't even so much Aramaic as much as it was because they were talking about the names of places and what different people called the same thing. Those words just kind of slipped in, kind of like when I used to teach English and I would teach my students who were Spanish, they would sometimes talk to me and I would call it Spanglish. And I mean, they didn't mind me calling it that because they would sometimes speak a couple of words in Spanish, but they would be speaking English. So they would throw in these vocabulary words from Spanish, but they would have maybe the English grammatical structure of their sentence because they were talking to me. But they also knew that I understood what they were saying because, for example, if even in modern English, if we say, hey, you know what, amigo, you need to watch yourself. What we're really saying there is we're saying, hey, friend, you need to watch yourself. Right? So that's a Spanish word, though, dropped into our language. And that's exactly what happened in Genesis. It's just that there was like a couple of words that were dropped in because it was more like, hey, amigo, or, you know, sometimes people will just, even Americans who don't speak any Spanish at all whatsoever, will use words like hola, just to be funny or just to think, you know, what they know it. Or they'll be like, you know, vámonos, let's go. And they'll say things like that. So what you need to understand is that we do this in English a lot. And so it's not surprising that, you know, that Moses did this in one verse in Genesis, where he used a couple of words that were Aramaic. But the bigger parts are in Daniel. And this is where we see that it is significant as far as when it was, because really it was about the Babylonian Empire that Aramaic was the trade language and the written language. It was the language used for documents. And that's what was key. So it was used in Daniel chapters 2, 4, all the way through 7:28. So there's a huge section that's in Aramaic in the book of Daniel. And Ezra as well. There's huge sections of Ezra that are in Aramaic. But if you notice in Ezra, it's documenting correspondence related to the rebuilding of the temple. So it actually makes sense because it's talking about the correspondence, and the correspondence would have been written in Aramaic. So of course, let's just correspond in Aramaic right in Ezra. And then also Jeremiah verse 10:11 is also in Aramaic. Now keep in mind, Jeremiah was written just as the Babylonians were just taking over. And so Aramaic was definitely something that they would have done. Now, let's talk about what the other section of the Bible is. So we've talked about Hebrew, and we'll go back and we're going to talk this through a little bit. But the next section of the Bible we're going to talk about here is Greek. And so we're going to talk about, let's see here. We'll go to the Greek. Here we go. So all of the New Testament was in Greek. Some scholars will say Matthew was written in Hebrew or Aramaic first, but the general consensus is that it was written in Koine Greek. And then there's what's called the Septuagint. We'll talk about that, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament. All right, so we've kind of got some of the definitions down. Let's dig into this a little bit. We're going to hit each of these languages step by step. All right, so let's go back to our playlist. And we're just going to go ahead and play this. All right. So first of all, we start off with the Bible is written in Hebrew, right? So Hebrew, and why is it written in Hebrew? Well, because that was the language of the Israeli people. It still is the language of the Israeli people. And because the Old Testament was written for the Israelites, it makes sense if it's in their language. So Hebrew, we're going to put on our notes here, Hebrew is what the Old Testament was written in originally. Because, well, and if we even look at the New Testament, the book of Hebrews, although it's written in Greek, but the book of Hebrews is written to the Israelites. That's written to the Hebrew people, or what we refer to as the Israelites now. Or Israelis actually is how we call them now. So was written in originally because the Israelites, as they were referred to in the Bible, were Hebrew, and it was their language. And the Old Testament was written to them. Okay? So the Old Testament was written to them. So that's why it was written in Hebrew. It's just as simple as that. But why is this important? Well, let's talk first about this KJV person. This person who came onto my page and was saying, well, I hope you're taking these dates from the KJV because otherwise you're going to be wrong if you use the other versions. And I said, well, I am using the KJV, so don't get me wrong. I do think the King James Version of the Bible is one of the most accurate versions that we have to date. But the language of the King James Version is difficult for some people to access. It's why I started this channel. And even the NIV that a lot of people use as well is difficult for some people to access or understand. So we need to understand, however, that the King James Version didn't exist until 1611. And our version of English didn't even really exist until the late 1400s, 1500s. So are we saying that God's word didn't exist until that point in history? Well, no. And in fact, the King James Version people will tell you, and we will say, it is a translation. It is called the King James Version translation. So I have King James Version, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and this in the front of mine, it says, a complete numerical system using Strong's numbers to identify and transliterate all the key words of the Bible. Exegetical notes to each thing, compiled, and this is red letter edition. So this is a translation. It says right here, let's see here, at the very beginning of my Bible, it talks about the Hebrew Greek Key Study Bible is a unique tool for the students of Scripture, whether or not they have a knowledge of biblical languages. For the first time, a reader can hold an English Bible and know primary Hebrew and Greek words corresponding to the English translation. Translation. That's what we call it, with grammatical peculiarities explained. So the King James Version is a translation. So what is a translation? It is when we take one language and translate it so we understand it in another language. Everybody knows what a translation is. Everybody knows what a translator is. You have translators at the UN that they translate from other languages into English, or translate English into other languages. They have those fancy headsets that do it automatically. Well, here's the thing, or that have translators, but I think they're moving towards an AI model of that as well, where it just automatically translates those key things for them. So why is this important? Because the King James Version of the Bible is a translation. It is not the original language of the Bible. The original language for the Old Testament was Hebrew. So I want to make that really clear. The original language of the Bible, of the Old Testament, was Hebrew, because it was written for the Hebrews. In fact, we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego referred to as the three Hebrew children because they were of Israeli descent. They were Israelites. And so the Old Testament was written in Hebrew because that's what the Israelites and or Israelis, as they're referred to today, were called. They were called Hebrews, and that was their language, was Hebrew. All right. So now let's talk about Aramaic. So Aramaic, and I'm going to put the note here, was the trade language surrounding the rise of Babylon in the world. Okay, so throughout history, we've seen trade languages swap. In most recent history, by the way, many of you may not know this, but the English has not been the trade language of the world forever. In fact, French was the trade language of the world for the vast majority of the 18th and 19th century. It was only as Britain conquered and colonized a lot of the world that English became the trade language of the world. So that's kind of different. So keep that in mind, that it hasn't always been that. So, so where we go? So Aramaic. So at the time that Daniel was written, at the time that Jeremiah was written, Aramaic was a trade language. So there are some verses. Ezra is the same. Ezra was after the Babylonian Empire, but they were still in charge of the world, kind of. I mean, the Medes and the Persians had taken them over, but just like every trade language, it doesn't automatically just snap a finger and go. Just because the Medes and Persians conquered doesn't mean that trade language disappeared automatically. It took a few years for that to happen. Normally takes about 100 years for a trade language to shift from one to another. So for centuries, actually, like I said, French was the trade language of the world. Now it happens to be English. There are some people who believe there's a possibility that at some point in the future, Mandarin Chinese will be taking over as the next trade language. This is why some parents teach their children Mandarin. This is why, as a young child, sometimes they want them to learn Mandarin, because it's a trade language. So the Old Testament was written in Hebrew for the Hebrews, because that's who it was written for primarily. However, because some of the correspondence and some of the things that were taking place in the Old Testament were during the Babylonian Empire and related to the correspondence that happened at that time, some of the Bible was originally written in Aramaic. It was like Daniel kind of went back and forth, and the same with Ezra. They spoke both languages so they could write back and forth between them. In fact, Daniel probably spoke somewhere between 4 to 5 languages at least, because he would have known Hebrew from a child. He would obviously have spoken. He was considered a child of the wealthy in Israel. So even still, he was a prince of Israel, so to speak. And so he would have known Aramaic because he would have known how to speak that language. And then getting into the Babylonian, he would have learned the languages for the Medo-Persians when they took over the city of Babylon. So we don't think that Daniel probably learned Greek, but it was pretty close to Daniel's time. Because then we move into the New Testament, okay? So we move into the New Testament, and that's where we see Greek. Now, what you need to understand about Greek is that we are not talking about modern-day Greek. We are talking about Koine Greek. And Koine Greek is an ancient language that is technically dead at this point. Now, does the alphabet still exist? Yes, it does. We still use the Greek alphabet, but the grammar, the syntax, and the vocabulary of Koine Greek is quite different from modern Greek. But that's kind of normal. In the realm of languages, the same thing happened. So what we would consider the beginning of English or English literature, would have been a story called Beowulf. But if you sat down and read Beowulf in its original version of, and this is going to sound funny, but of English, you would not even be able to read it in its original form and understand it. And the same with Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. They're really early English. And as far as like what we would consider closer to modern, they're actually considered Middle English. So we don't have early English in those. We have Middle English, and then we have modern. So what you might find funny is that the King James Version and Shakespeare, they are considered modern English. That's right. Modern English. And that's because they are very similar. We can still read the King James Version if we are educated. We can still read Shakespeare and understand it if we are educated. So it is not that hard. However, the same is true of Koine Greek. A Greek person could sit down and they might be able to pronounce it out, but if they don't know the vocabulary of the time, they would not understand it because it's 2,000 years ago. So let's talk a little bit about Koine Greek. I actually have some notes that I printed out for myself here just to make sure we were doing this right. So it's a specific form of ancient Greek, also known as Hellenistic or Biblical Greek, but Hellenistic is probably because it was from that period in history. And it was widely spoken and written during that period, which is roughly 323 BC, all the way up to 30 BC, but it was still the trade language of the world for a good another 100 years. Like we said, just like every other trade language, it just doesn't flip-flop very quickly. It's a simplified version of the earlier classical Greek. So keep in mind, it is not the same as classical Greek. It's not the same. And it was used, Koine Greek was used as the common language across loads of regions. So how do we know this? Well, first of all, Alexander the Great conquered the world, that's where he spread the Greek Empire, and that's how Greek spread across the world, and that's why it became the trade language. But then the Greeks were conquered by the Romans well prior to the BC, 100 plus years before. But one of the things that the Romans were best known for is for taking what other cultures had and just kind of absorbing them into their own culture. Sometimes they improved on them. And Koine Greek is kind of that. Classical Greek is what somebody from Alexander the Great's time period would have spoken and dealt with, Socrates, etc. But then Koine Greek was the Romans taking that Greek and modernizing it and making it better, because that's what they like to do. So, but it was spoken all across the world. It was used as a common language across diverse regions, and it was influenced, like we said, by Alexander the Great's conquest. While all forms of Koine Greek are considered ancient, not all ancient Greek is Koine. All right, and Koine is spelled K-O-I-N-E, but it's pronounced Koine. All right, so basically, classical Greek was from like the 5th and the 4th centuries, and Koine Greek came around in the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st centuries, essentially, or BC, I should say. 1st, 2nd, 3rd BC, and then into the 1st century as well, because that's what everybody spoke. It was developed after the classical period. It emerged as a common language due to increased interaction and trade between different Greek-speaking regions. It is simplified grammar and vocabulary. It is a much more simplified version of Greek than classical Greek is. So just keep that in mind. All right. So Koine Greek includes vocabulary from various Greek dialects, not just Attic, and also incorporates some vocabulary that's influenced by other languages. So it did have like Hebrew words and Aramaic words and all sorts of things that the influence of the world would have been wrapped into it. But the pronunciation was initially similar to classical Greek. It gradually shifted with some what are called diphthongs. We won't go into all that, becoming monophthongs, and voiced plosives becoming voiced fricatives. I'm not going to go into that. If you want to learn more about that, look up what plosives are, look up what fricatives are. I will tell you that plosives are usually like in English, our plosives are P's, p, b, d, but like those p, those sounds. That's what we're considered plosives. Usage. Koine Greek is the language of the New Testament and the Septuagint, which we're going to talk about in a second. It was also the language of everyday communication in the Hellenistic world. It is what everybody spoke. It is what everybody heard, is what everybody knew. And there are some scholars that say that Aramaic is what the Bible was first written in, but most scholars don't agree with that. Most scholars agree that it was Greek and it was Koine Greek. The other controversy, so to speak, is that there are some scholars who think that the book of Matthew may have been written in Hebrew, and they base that on the fact that it was written to the Jews. The book of Matthew was written specifically to the Jews, but the vast majority of scholars disagree with that. They say, no. It may have been translated into Hebrew because it was translated into Hebrew because well, first of all, the whole of the Bible has been translated into Hebrew for people who read Hebrew today and don't speak other languages. Although most Israelis do speak multiple language. But anyway, they want to read in Hebrew because that is kind of like, especially if they're a Bible reader, that's kind of a big deal because that's their language. That's like the language of God in their mind. So, Matthew has been translated into Hebrew and may have even been translated in the early church into Hebrew because it was written to the Hebrews. It was written to the Israelites. And so, to the nation of Israel, to Jews, as we would say. But why is all this important? You're like, okay, wait, oh my gosh, my head's spinning, etc. Why do I need to know this? Well, here's the main reason. Because anytime somebody tells you that the King James Version of the Bible is the inerrant word of God that cannot be changed and is never wrong, and etc., you got to ask them why they think that, because that's not what the Bible was written in. If we want to be truly accurate, we really need to talk about the fact that, excuse me, my eye just started itching. The Bible was written in Hebrew, and it was written a little bit in Aramaic, and it was written in Greek. That's it. And if you really want to know what a word or a passage means, you go back to the original language, to the Hebrew, to the Greek, or to the Aramaic. Now, that's one of the reasons why I love my Greek Hebrew study Bible, because while I do know a lot of Greek. Okay, so that passage I read to you at the beginning, and Ido the Aklas, he went up into the Aras, and when he kathizo, his metheses came unto him. That is, and seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, and didasco, and anoigo his see, I can't say it anymore. And Ido, and seeing. And Ido the Aklas, the multitudes or the masses, is actually what Aklas means, the absolute masses. He went up into a mountain. And Ido the Aklas, he went up into a mountain. And when he was kathizo, or set down, his methetes, his disciples, came unto him. And he anoigoed, opened, which means to start anoigo actually means more to start it has the implication of starting speaking. Anoigoed his mouth, and didasco, which is taught. It's just a form of the word teach, them saying. Makarios. Makarios means blessed. It means blessings upon everyone. Makarios are the tokas. Now, what's this really, really important to hear here is that the word tokas or poor in our Bible in verse 3 of Matthew 5, the word poor, it's translated the word poor. That does not encapsulate what that word actually means. Tokas, or patokas as I used to say it, but tokas, the PT sound, like Ptolemy the Great. But anyway, tokas actually means the abject lowest of the poor. Makarios are the tokas en pneuma. Pneuma means spirit. We get words like pneumonia from the word pneuma in spirit here. So what's interesting about learning Greek or Hebrew is being able to go back into the Bible and being able to see the original language and see those fine details. Like that, the fact that the word tokas doesn't just mean poor, like, oh, I don't have much money. It means the absolute abject lowest level of poor. The most humble. And so that's why the vocabulary of the Greek New Testament is so important when we are interpreting it. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Septuagint as well. So the Septuagint is when the Old Testament was translated into Koine Greek, because that was the language of the people. That was what the people knew. And so in order for them to be able to be in their temples and do things, they wanted to still be able to read it, but most people only spoke, a lot of people only spoke, and especially non-Jews only spoke Koine Greek. They didn't speak Hebrew. They didn't know Hebrew. Hebrew was just what the Jews spoke. So the Septuagint was the translation of the Old Testament into that common Greek, so that everybody in the New Testament, even those who didn't know the other, could read it. Now, why is this important? Because translations are really important. And when the translators of the King James Version of the Bible, okay, so let's talk about actually the next translation. So Greek is the original for the New Testament. Hebrew is the original for the Old Testament with a smattering of Aramaic. Septuagint is the first translation. We see the Hebrew being translated into Greek. What's the next translation? The next translation is Latin. And that was when, because the Roman world actually spoke Latin. This is where we get the idea of Latin languages. French, Spanish, Portuguese, those are all Latin languages. But they come from Latin, which is what the Romans spoke in Italy at the time, okay? Our modern Italian, French, Portuguese, Spanish all is, okay, we don't call Italian Latin anymore because it's not Latin. It is actually Italian, which is different from the original Latin. So the first Bible translations, complete translations, were into Latin, but the common man did not speak Latin in most of Europe. Not for a very long time. And they might have spoken some of it, but they definitely did not read it during the Dark Ages. And so what brought about the King James Version? Well, basically the Reformation and the idea that the printing press, people wanted to, with the movable type printing press, the Gutenberg printing press, the very first book that was printed was a Bible, the Gutenberg Bible. And not in English, by the way. But it was the very first Bible was printed for the masses to enjoy, and that was the Gutenberg Bible. And the Bible became very popular in the 1500s, and so King James commissioned an English version of the Bible. Now, what did the King James Version come from? So did it get translated from the Latin? No. What makes the King James Version such a great translation, okay? The reason it's such a great translation is because the scholars who translated the King James Version went all the way back to the original Greek, went all the way back to the original Hebrew, not just the Septuagint. They didn't translate from the Septuagint. They went back to the Greek New Testament. They went back to the Hebrew Old Testament and the Aramaic, and they translated that into English. And that's what brought us are modern day versions. And any translation out there that is worth its salt does not take itself from the previous versions, because that's how you get a version of Chinese Whispers. You know Chinese Whispers, the game as a kid that you used to play? You'd whisper in your friend's ear, and then they would have to then hear what you said, and they would say it to the next person, and they would go all around the circle and it'd get back, and by the time it got back, what did the person actually say? Who knows? It was always some kind of gobbledygook. That's what made it a great party game. But if you just take a translation and then you translate the translation off the translation. So if you take a translation off of the King James Version, you're going to have problems. If the King James Version had been taken off of the Latin, we would have had problems. But it wasn't. It was taken off of the Greek and the Hebrew, the original languages. And that's what made it so significant and so important. And this is why the King James Version is not the only version. This is why I will not be KJV only, and you will never hear me support that on this channel. I will support the Hebrew. I will support the Greek. Those are the original languages. Now, I'm going to play you we're going to play you a little bit of a video here, because some people are like, well, maybe I should learn a biblical language. Maybe I should, you know, increase my knowledge and learn a whole biblical language. Well, here we go. I'm going to play you a little bit of a video. There's a great channel on YouTube if you are interested in learning more about biblical languages. And let me find their name. Oh, goodness. Where are they again? I had them up before, and I apologize because I cannot find them. Oh. Okay, it's not on that one. I had a ton of things up. Let's see. It's not on there. Ah, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to mute that so I can go back. Their channel is called @BMA. All right, so their channel is called @BMA, and it is actually Biblical Mastery Academy. All right, biblicalmastery.academy. But they do Greek mastery and they do Hebrew mastery. That's what they do. And when I was doing some of this research for you guys, I was like, this is awesome. Love this. And definitely wanted to show this to you. So I'm going to switch to this camera so that I can show you their stuff. And here we go. Let me play this for you.
Greek or Hebrew first. If you're more interested in the Hebrew Old Testament, then I think probably Hebrew might be a better choice. However, if you're interested in the Greek New Testament and perhaps the Septuagint and some of those sorts of writings, then Greek might be a better starting point. Possibly the most important consideration to take into account. For most people, learning one of these languages is plenty. In fact, many people will struggle to learn both languages because it is actually really hard to grow to a high degree of fluency with both languages. If you're interested in this as a literary pursuit, then pursuing one of these may be all that you're actually able to pursue with any real vigor. So bear that in mind as you start this. If you could only do one, which one would it be? If you could only choose one of the two languages to work in, and you never had the choice of a second one, I would choose that first language to work on as your first priority. Should I learn Greek or Hebrew first? If you're more interested in the Hebrew Old Testament, then
Oh, there we go. Don't need that to go on a loop. All right, so I will tell you personally, I go for Greek. And the main reason I go for Greek is because the Old Testament was translated into Greek, the Septuagint. So you can get basically the entire Bible if you just learn Koine Greek. And my dad was a Greek professor, so I probably come by that naturally. That's why I favor Greek as far as the one that I know best. I do understand certain Hebrew words, but I also struggle with the whole backwards to front reading in a Hebrew Bible. Whereas Koine Greek, you still read it just like you do in English, where you're reading it from front, like you're reading it from left to right. Well, Hebrew is read from right to left. And it starts at what we would call the back of the book. It starts at the back and works its way forward, so to speak. So it seems backwards to my brain. And that's why I'm not really good at reading Hebrew. But if you don't want to learn either of them, get yourself a Greek Hebrew study Bible. There is a link on in the description that you can go and order one, and it is one of the best things in this entire Bible. First of all, it has notes throughout it, but even without the notes throughout it, I'm going to go to the back here and show you how large the lexical aids and dictionary are. Okay, you learn so much because this is the Bible right here. And this section right here is all those lexical aids, all those study aids. This right here is the Bible. But even within this Bible, I'm going to show you, if I go to the beginning of a book, doesn't matter which book, at the beginning of each book of the Bible, you will see it has, like, so example, the book of John. You can see it has a whole section here. Whoops, sorry, this side. The whole section here, all the way down. And that is showing you, that is telling you a lot of introductory material. My intros to that start with this and then go off into other research. But I always go to this first because Spiros Odiates was such an amazing scholar. He was so dedicated to precision that I always start with him and then branch out from him for more research. So if you want to be able to do that for yourself, then get yourself the Spiros Odiates Greek Hebrew Study Bible. There is a link in my channel to the Amazon store. I do, and I'm not going to deny this, I do get a small percentage, but it is a small percentage. It is not about that. If you want to go order it from somewhere else, that's fine. You don't have to use the link in my description. But get yourself a Greek Hebrew Study Bible. And if you want to support my channel, order it through here. It doesn't cost you any more to order it through my link. So it's just really easy to do. So the Greek, the Koine Greek, we've talked about that a lot. We've talked about how it was the language of the people, and that's why it was. So next time you hear somebody tell you a translation of the Bible is that's the only word of God, no other translations work, that's not true. And especially if you have someone like I did the other day who said, what Greek? What Greek? And because if you do some more research, pretty much the Erasmus Greek, the Tyndale Greek, all of the Greek Bibles that are out there, there's like very little variation. In fact, if you go to BMA, that video I just showed you, that same people, they have a short that talks about the number of these things, was which is the best Greek one. Almost all of them are not, they're not translations. They're almost all identical. And there's really no difference between them. There's no marked difference between any of the Greek Bibles because that's a difference between them and English. So if you want, go ahead and check out BMA. I would definitely recommend them as a channel. Very fascinating, very interesting on this subject. If you're interested in learning more about Greek or Hebrew and mastering it as a language for the Bible so that you can learn more, they're the experts on this. I'm not the expert. I just like it and I like to do it. And I know quite a bit of Greek because of my dad and because of my Bible study that I've done throughout the years. So yeah, so hopefully this has been helpful to you. And if you do find any value from this content, do me a favor. If you found any value today at all, I know it was kind of long, do me a favor, click like, subscribe, turn on that notification bell so you don't miss any content. And I will see you again tomorrow when we are back in Genesis. And now carrying on with the story of Jacob. So, bye for now.
I am alone. Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus.